Welcome to episode 214 of FBI Retired Case File Review with Jerry Williams. I'm a retired agent on a mission to show you who the FBI is and what the FBI does through my books, my blog, and my podcast case reviews with former colleagues. Today, we get to speak to retired agent Andy Bringuel, who served in the FBI for over 27 years, investigating intellectual property theft, industrial espionage, public corruption, white-collar crimes, terrorism, and foreign counterintelligence. In this episode, Andy reviews his 5-year-long Acmar Landfill case, where evidence was gathered to prove owners were illegally disposing of solid waste in a manner that resulted in discharge of leachate and other pollutants into the Big Black Creek in St. Clair County, Alabama. The investigation also involved associates of the Genovese crime family in New York and corrupt local officials. As a result of the case, Andy Bringuel received the Attorney General's Award for Environmental Crimes Investigation. Later in his career, Andy was promoted to Supervisory Special Agent in the Behavioral Science Unit, BSU, and the Behavioral Analysis Unit, BAU 5, as well as other management positions. Andy has instructed police officers and executives at the FBI National Academy and in services around the world at the International Law Enforcement Academies. Since his retirement from the Bureau, Andy Bringuel is the executive director of the Behavioral Science Unit, LLC, a private security, training, consulting, and research firm. He is available for keynote lectures on issues involving human beliefs and behaviors, and has been interviewed in Newsweek, New York Times, and the Huffington Post on issues ranging from workplace violence to terrorism. This is a fascinating case review. Andy and his co-case agent used some really innovative techniques to work this case. But before we get to the interview, I want to know if you've seen the new and refreshed podcast cover art for FBI Retired Case File Review. I mentioned to my friend, fellow podcaster, and mastermind partner, Javier Leyva, host of Pretend Radio, that I wanted a cleaner, stripped-down design, and he created my new logo. So what do you think? I love it. Thank you, Javier. And I also want to thank you for all the emails that came in congratulating me on my new job, or jobs, as a TV technical consultant, which I wrote about in my October Reader Team email. I promise to tell you more when I can, but I wanted to share my cool news with you. Also today, Wednesday, October 14th, I sent to all Reader Team members an email with the link for our next Zoom meetup scheduled for the end of the month. If you don't see the email in your inbox, you know what to do. Check your spam filter and your promotion tab. For those of you who write crime fiction, I can't wait to hang out with you again and answer all your questions to help you get the FBI right in your stories. Of course, I want to welcome new listeners and invite you to join my reader team. This podcast is all about true crime, but if you're also interested in crime fiction, once a month via my monthly email, I keep you up to date on the FBI in books, TV, and movies. When you join my reader team, you get access to my FBI reading resource, which is a colorful list of more than 50 books about the FBI written by the FBI agents who have been guests on this podcast. There's nonfiction, crime fiction, true crime, and memoir. You can join my reader team on my website or use the link in your podcast app's description of this episode. I want to thank you for your support. Now here's the show. I want to welcome my guest, Andrew Bringuel. Hi, Andy. How are you?
I'm doing well, Jerry. How are you?
I'm doing great. I am excited because it's one of those kind of hybrid cases that you worked on. And I understand that it has a little bit of corruption, It has a little bit of organized crime, but it has a whole lot of environmental fraud involved in it too. Did I explain that right?
You hit it right on the head, Jerry. It was an odd case at a time when the Bureau started getting interested in environmental crimes and were developing task forces around the country.
All right. So why don't you take us from the top? Where were you assigned? And, how did you first become involved in this investigation? Was there a name for it?
Well, it was called the Acmar Landfill case simply because it was the Acmar Landfill. Wasn't a major case, but it was associated with a major case in New York called CartNab, which was an OC case out of New Rochelle, RA. And I'll get into that a little bit because we kind of stumbled into the OC aspects of this investigation as the case unfolded. But it really started back before I was even an agent. I didn't become an agent until 1990. My first office of assignment was Birmingham, Alabama. When I was there, about 2 years into my time, I started in 1990. About 1992, the end of 1992, I was told by my supervisor, Phil Bouvier, that, Andy, you're going to be the guy working environmental crimes. And I said, you might want to look at my school transcripts in my science classes because, I can barely pronounce, methyl ethyl ketone. And I certainly didn't know what it meant. But he said, no, you're going to go to Los Angeles. We're going to send you to an in-service. I went to the in-service, got educated in Los Angeles where they were much more progressive. And they started task forces in southern part of California. So I came back, as a brand new agent, full of energy, and went to Bouvier's office and I said, hey, boss, I'd like to start a task force. And this is 1992. He says, son, we don't work task forces. If you want to develop some hip pocket informants, then go ahead with, the locals or the state, but we don't have the money for task forces. And I left his office with my tail between my legs. And I said, well, okay, now how can I apply what I learned in the in-service to what's going on? To start the case, really you have to go back to before I was an agent in 1987. In 1987, there was a guy, they call him garbage brokers. And this guy's name was Lowell Harrelson. You're going to recognize this story as I tell it. But in 1987, there's about 25,000 tons of garbage daily in New York City that goes away from New York City, either to Pennsylvania, West Virginia, the surrounding states, and landfills. And in 1987, Lowell Harrelson, a garbage broker, brokered some garbage from New York City, put it on a barge called the Mobro. Mobro barge later became the garbage barge. You remember this story about
Absolutely. It just kept going around and around with nowhere to land.
Up and down the eastern seaboard, Jerry, this barge had every town it went to in North Carolina, it was supposed to be dumped. And they basically came up with this cliche, not in my backyard, NIMB. And what happened was an awakening in late 80s, early 90s, that we had a solid waste management problem in the country. And so railing garbage, shipping garbage became a big issue all the way to the federal level. In this particular case, the garbage barge went up and down the New York eastern seaboard from New York down all the way to Florida and then back and eventually incinerated in Long Island. The individuals that were the owners of the particular incinerator were associates with Lucchese criminal organized crime family. So that happened in 1987. Lowell Harrelson continued to broker garbage. That was his job. He was out of Mobile, Alabama, and I was in Birmingham division. So not associated at that point. In 1990, I come into the field division. I work white collar, public corruption, and OC cases. This is before organized crime as a program was moved over to the violent crime squads. So at the time, Squad 4, which is the white collar, public corruption, environmental crimes, and we handled all of the white collar stuff. And as I told you, Phil Bouvier said, Andy, you're going to be working these environmental crimes. And I said, okay, great. And what happened was in 1993, I'm reading the newspaper and I come across an article, and the story is basically about New York garbage carting companies coming into Alabama and using the same predatory pricing practices that the organized crime groups in New York had used to take over stops. And the person in the article that was the aggrieved party, Durwood Jackson, owned a company called Waste Away. So I called Durwood Jackson and I said, can I come and speak with you? And he said, sure. So after interviewing Durwood, I opened an REI case, a racketeering enterprise investigation. They have time limits on them. You've got to, develop them into a RICO case or some other type of investigation if you can't develop any kind of reasonable suspicion to continue it as a full investigation. I was a new agent, not really schooled in organized crime at all, didn't really know the databases that were available, but this is in 1992 timeframe. And about the same time, an older agent, OP agent came in. So an office of preference retiree, or close to retiree, came into the division, and he had come from Miami where he worked organized crime. His name was Jake Jacobson. And so Jake comes onto the squad. He's sitting a couple cubicles away from me. He overhears me talking about the Acmar case. And he comes over and says, hey, can I, look at your file and talk to you about your case? I kind of work this stuff down in Miami, and I might be able to help you. So after a couple talks with Jake, I decided, this case might be better off if Jake and I worked as a partner. We went to Bouvia and said, hey, can we be co-case agents? And Bouvia said, that's a good idea. And so that's how it started. In 1993, it really kicked off because what Durwood Jackson told us was that garbage was coming from New York via a rail car from a company that was called All Services, owned by a guy named Tommy Milo. I was unaware, being a new agent and really not going to an in-service on organized crime, that the FBI maintained a central database on organized crime families and associates. OSIS was the name of the database. And Jake was very familiar with it because of his time in Miami. And so we started doing some preliminary inquiries into the database. And lo and behold, we start coming up with names associated with our landfill that are associated with companies up in New York and Atlanta, Georgia. After about 3 or 4 months, we decide we're going to open this as a RICO case. And so that's how it began. The case lasted 5 years from cradle to grave. And it really started as this charge that Durwood Jackson outlined in terms of predatory pricing. What they were doing was they had a carton company called Alabama Waste Services. And it was interesting because all of the companies in New York that was associated with Acmar had the same initials but different names. So, it was Alabama Waste Services, All Waste Services, and so forth and so on. With the notable exception of Suburban Carting, which was Tommy Milo's main company up in New Rochelle.
Could you give us just a quick background on the association of organized crime with landfills and garbage and overhauling? I've done one other episode about this 2 or 3 years ago, but it might be good to get a little background on that association. Many people may not be aware of it.
And that's the interesting thing about this particular case. Not only was it the longest investigation that I was part of in terms of, maybe a couple fugitive cases, but this was a 5-year investigation. And there were a number of aspects which we'll get into. But to your point, the organized crime families in the 5 boroughs of New York City would often infiltrate carting companies. They will use different types of predatory tactics, giving them the owner a deal they can't refuse, so to speak, mostly surrounded to the garbage landfills, which they also control. And the saying in the industry is, he who holds the keys to the landfill owns the carting companies, because you set the pricing for the tipping fees. And so that was no different in the Acmar case. What they did was they bought a piece of land, and this is the association to the earlier point I made about Lowell Harrelson. They were looking for a piece of property that they could dump garbage in, a landfill. And there was an old strip mine called the Acmar strip mine. So going back to the 1950s, this piece of land in Moody, Alabama was strip mined for coal. And if you know anything about strip mining, the process, which is now banned, they would literally rip away the soil to get to the veins of coal, leaving giant holes, and many times sinkholes would develop because the aquifer underneath the soil would collapse and you would have giant sinkholes. So in Moody, Alabama, there was this strip mine that Lowell Harrelson had partial ownership in. And lo and behold, this group out of New York comes in and they seize it, basically. They squeezed him out. Originally, he was a part owner. After interviewing Mr. Harrelson, he was less than cooperative. what we could gather from the interview and from other documents, he basically was given nothing for his investment in that property. That's when Tommy Milo's group out of New York came in, and they placed a gentleman by the name of Paul Marcus Burke as the sole proprietor of Alabama Waste Services, but was a subsidiary of this larger group out of New York. This is very typical of their tactics. The predatory pricing, going back to your point of how they would take over a territory, they would literally have somebody follow a garbage truck to a commercial site. And they would go in after the garbage men were, the company was hauling the dumpster away. They would go to the proprietor of that shop and say, what are you paying for a dumpster pull? And they would say, I don't know, $45. They said, we'll do it for $30. So they will undercut the garbage carting companies in order to take those stops because they own the landfill. So they can set the tipping fees. And so if they can't get the stop, they'll increase the tipping fees so that Durwood Jackson's profit margins on his contract are negligible, and he'll basically bleed out and be in a position where he'll sell his company for nothing. So those are some of the tactics, the strong arm tactics that they will use in order to gain territory. The other tactics that they will use is they will infiltrate and corrupt local public officials. Usually it's the city council or the mayor, or in conjunction, the city council and mayor, that set the garbage contracts. In Alabama, they were required to bid these contracts. And as I'll explain a little bit, the Acmar case, they avoided that in the Moody city. A guy named James Solly, who was our first case that we tried, was corrupted by Paul Burke and this operation. I started working with Jake and basically doing the research on the parties involved. A guy named Tony Farino was the Italian placed at the landfill. But the general manager and the voice and face of the landfill was a guy named Paul Marcus Burke. And so we started working the investigation as covertly as you possibly can in a small town, right? So we started doing some preliminary interviews under the guise of a public corruption investigation, not talking about the environmental aspects of the case at that time, and not even really knowing about some of the Clean Water Act violations at that time. We started working the case with Durwood Jackson's complaint, and that's what really initiated it.
How brave was it of him to even complain? Was he aware of the Organized Crime Association? Did he know what he was getting himself into?
No, I don't think he did. And that came into effect later in the investigation as it became clear who these people were. Again, the face of this operation was Paul Burke, who was a garbage man, if you will, lack of a better term. He was a proprietor of a carting company out of Louisville, Kentucky. And Paul, from all outward appearances, looked like a businessman. He dressed in very fine suits. He dated a news reporter out of New York City. He went to all the fancy parties. He donated to all of the political campaigns. He was the front man of this operation. And so, no, I don't think Durwood Jackson knew who he was really dealing with. And when it became clear to some of these politicians who they were dealing with, in one case, a city council member told Jake and I, you can put me in jail. They will put me 6 feet under. So they're more afraid of what these groups out of New York could possibly do to them, at least in their mind, than what the federal government could do to them. We worked this case for, probably the first 6 months, just trying to find, in fact, is there enough evidence to continue this as a full investigation? We ran into another investigation I was running separate, was on some illegally disposed of asbestos by a guy named Story, who owned a carting company. And so we go talk to Sam Story, Jake and I do, and he mentions the Acmar landfill and how the reason he illegally dumped the asbestos was because the tipping fees keep getting increased because the landfill is trying to buy him out, and he's being squeezed out. So with that information, we open a full investigation and we start looking at basically the regulations within the Alabama Department of Environmental Management and how carting companies and landfills are developed in the state of Alabama. So for the listeners, there are some federal regulations that EPA has in terms of how landfills are supposed to be developed and managed. But a lot of the actual management and supervision of those practices at the state level. And there's no there's no coincidence that Alabama and Mississippi historically have been, in the low half of the states in terms of environmental protection and regulations and enforcement. At the time, and it's been many years, so they may have changed this, but the Alabama Department of Environmental Management, ADEM, they had no enforcement unit in the department. They were only compliance. So their philosophy was, if you have someone polluting, say putting effluent into a navigable waterway of the United States, their job was to have that business owner stop doing that by educating them. So they really didn't look at criminal intent. So, and they would never give a referral to the FBI, for example, because we do have, jurisdiction with EPA on Clean Water Act violations, Clean Air Act violations, and a number of other.
So they were operating under the understanding that somebody who was polluting, say, a waterway was doing it because they lacked education, when in most cases, they're just trying to save money and they don't care.
Exactly. And that'll become apparent in this particular case. So what happened was we started working this investigation by trying to determine what the violations might be and could we develop an informant on the landfill itself. And so, as I mentioned, the story confirmed a lot of what Jackson had reported to the newspaper. Jackson's cooperation was somewhat limited after that. The fact that he was angry that his carting stops were being taken from him and stolen, as he stated. So the value of Story and Jackson was they turned us towards Moody, the town of Moody, and the contracts. It was Jackson who told Jake and I that he lost the bid for the city contracts at Moody, and he was giving them 2 times a week pickup for $12 and change. And that he said Paul Burke comes in and starts Alabama Waste Services and takes the contract without a competitive bid, gives them 1 pickup a week, and doubles the charge to like $22. So that's a red flag for Jake and I. And we're like, okay, what would be the incentive for these politicians to cut the contract, the service in half, but double the rate? Was there a kickback? What was going on there? So then we started looking at the regulations. We went to ADEM. I made some really good friends there. And as Phil had suggested, some hip pocket informants, and educated them that, hey, at the federal level, we do have criminal enforcement if we can show knowledge and intent. So if ADEM is working their regulatory process and they discover evidence that the polluter knew what they were doing was wrong, right, then that's the knowledge and intent that we could go forward with our investigations. And so developed some really good working relationships with ADEM at that point. And that led us to looking at the blueprints for Acmar and how it was approved for waste disposal. And this was probably towards the end of 1983. And so before, let me go back to early 1983. In May of 1983, we get word that city council members from the city of Birmingham are going with Paul Burke to the Kentucky Derby. You were an agent. You know what I'm talking about here. So whenever we get an opportunity as agents to travel interdivisionally, operationally, we get excited.
Road trip.
Yeah, it's a boondoggle, as we call it. Right? It was a productive boondoggle nonetheless.
Yes.
So Jake and I ended up going to the 1993 Kentucky Derby. I'll get you some pictures of stuff that we did. We got with the Louisville office, and they helped us in conducting a surveillance. The city council members from the city of Birmingham living the high life at the Kentucky Derby with Paul Burke and a few guys from New York, including Tommy Milo. What Jake and I got out of this deal was some really good pictures of these associates with these suspected criminals. But we also got to go to Millionaires Row, because that evidently was the best platform for taking pictures and surveillance. And so we were hobnobbing with Rod Stewart and Joan Rivers and a number of other celebrities that typically wouldn't be around. So it was a pretty interesting experience, and we got some really good evidence and photos for later interviews of city council members. This 1993 was a pivotal point in this investigation because sometime in the summer, early fall, we decided to approach. Jake said, it's time we need to develop somebody inside the landfill, give us some eyes and ears of what's going on. And so we did a brush of a guy named, he was known as Chuck E. Cheese. And
you're going to have to let us know how he got that nickname. Yeah.
The nickname came from the place we first met him at. So there was nothing more in depth than that. We met him at a Chuck E. Cheese, and we had to come up with a name for him, a source name, and so he became Chuck E. Cheese. And Chucky was an interesting guy because he was the landfill manager at the time. He was being told to do a lot of stuff that was illegal. This was everybody's interested, what's the break in an investigation? So this had been going on. This case had been going on for about a year. And we've gotten, some good, suspicious activities, the trips by the public officials. We found evidence of Moody's city council being taken to Atlantic City and being given $5,000 a piece to gamble with by the landfill. So a lot of interesting evidence there, but nothing that the prosecutor, the AUSA, was really thrilled with. Until Chucky came involved. And Chucky, being the manager of the landfill, said, I'm not going to go to jail for anybody. And so, needless to say, that, piqued our curiosity. And so we, asked him the obvious question, what is it that you think you might go to jail for? And he said, okay, the federal regulations EPA has for landfilling requires a Subtitle D cell. Subtitle D are the regulations, it is a subtitle of the regulations that require landfills to install a leachate collection system. They're very expensive. And so Acmar, it's basically, imagine, Jerry, a garbage bag that is spread out on a landfill. And underneath that garbage bag are French drains that collect the liquid. The liquid refuse from garbage is called leachate. And it can be everything from soiled diapers to half cans of beans that were eaten to imagine whatever you throw away in terms of solid waste and the water from rain and snow melt and all, and whatever is then drained from that's leachate.
I learned something new today.
Yeah, it gives it's the rancid smell.
Oh, I know the smell.
Yeah.
I just didn't know the name of it.
Yeah, it's called leachate. So what they would do is collect this leachate every landfill is supposed to be doing this now, and they collect this refuse water, and they either treat it on site before the effluent goes into a stream or a pond, or it's trucked off site to a sanitary facility, and then the water's treated and then reintroduced. A couple interesting things about Acmar. It was not only built on this old coal strip mine, but it was also sitting on top of a very large aquifer that fed into the Black Creek, which was a tributary to the Cahaba River, both of which are navigable waterways of the United States. So any illegal effluent, any kind of pollutant that goes into the Black Creek eventually goes to the Cahaba River, eventually to the Gulf of Mexico, and it's a bad thing to do under the federal laws. Clean Water Act violations. So what Chucky tells us is that after they built this very fancy Subtitle D cell, which they did, it was about 1.5 acres at approximately $1.5 million. He was told by Paul Marcus Burke and Farino to dump all the waste on the west side face of the landfill, never to use the Subtitle D cell, but instead create a face on the west side of the landfill and 2 culverts. So he basically took front-end loaders, creating 2 culverts to allow the leachate to drain directly into Big Black Creek. So we're in this meeting with Chucky, and we're like looking at each other. We got this is the big violation that we need to have this thing go forward. We were also looking at money laundering and a couple other predicate offenses for RICO. And the idea was to, basically seize the landfill and put these bad guys in jail. So
did you also, as part of the case, did you have to prove that the elected officials knew this was happening, or just that they were taking kickbacks?
So that was a separate part of the investigation that we were working parallel. The public corruption aspect, was there quid pro quo under program fraud, 666, that we could prove, and then any ancillary kind of criminal behaviors thereof, including money laundering that comes from the illicit gains of the subjects. So that was part of the investigation, because you have in the criminal enterprise theory, you have a myriad number of criminal offenses that you work in simultaneously in investigating. So we were kind of separating at that point the criminal environmental crime case from the potential public corruption case. And this is again through 1993. But the big break in the case was this interview with Chucky. He becomes a cooperating witness, willing to testify, but very hesitant to do so because he knew the nature of the people he was working for, and insisting that we introduce him to the U.S. Marshal Service for witness protection. We're kind of pushing him off on that because, the case is not ready to be adjudicated or prosecuted in any manner in 1993. And we don't know exactly how dangerous these people are really at that point, other than, the association to the criminal group in New York. So we're trying to work Chucky to get us in, actual evidence. Can you secrete a camera, go on the landfill, show us what you're talking about, which he does. He does a number of things, Jerry, that I was very impressed with. We tested him several times. He carried everything through without any kind of remuneration at this point. He got nothing except maybe, a slice of pizza at Chuck E. Cheese. He did, as I mentioned, everything, including getting inside the buildings with a camera so that we could have enough probable cause for a Title III.
Yeah, could you explain that to people, why he was able to do that without us having any type of a search warrant? And so if you could explain to them, that this is in the normal course of his business.
So yes, of course. And the same thing with ADEM, by the way. ADEM and a lot of, fire departments are the same way. So your listeners might be interested in this. They have a legal right to be on property because of state law or federal law. So similarly, an employee has the right to be in the office. He has the right to be on property because he's an employee there. There is no expectation of privacy when an employee is in, the open space of a workplace. And that's what Chucky was. So in his due course of business, he was being asked to do different illegal things, including dumping this garbage on this illegal landfill cell. He would videotape this. He would videotape the exchange from either Farino or Burke telling him to go do this. And then he would, videotape the actual act. That gave us enough probable cause to get a search warrant for EPA. We asked EPA of Atlanta to come. Jake, myself, and an EPA agent dressed in camouflage in kayaks went upstream, and we kayaked down the river to the two effluent streams were coming into the river. We took what's known as split samples. Again, with the search warrant, we took samples of the effluent, which were then sent to Atlanta for analysis to show that they were actually pollutants. The first set of samples, unfortunately, were lost by EPA, and we never got the results. And so it gave us an excuse for a second kayak trip.
Do you like kayaking?
Yeah, it was a lot of fun, actually. For a new age, you're looking to do, covert kind of stuff. So it was pretty cool, for a young guy. Not so much for Jake, who was probably in his early 50s and complained about it the whole time. But we went down and got some good samples a second time. It showed that, in fact, we had some solvents, different types of pollutants. So we had a good, clear Clean Water Act violation at that point. But it also gave us enough probable cause based on what we got from Chucky to file an affidavit for a Title III. And so for your listeners, a Title III, they may have heard this from other episodes, is a surreptitious covert intercept of electronic communications. What made our Title III, I think, interesting in that era, that's probably very common nowadays, was it was the first time in the Northern District of Alabama that a Title III was written for a fax machine. And what was important about that is that we had 5 lines covered on our Title III affidavit, and then 1 separate line for the fax machine. But the telephones can be easily minimized. You have agents who sit in a room, and I'm sure you've done this in your career, and you listen for criminal conversation, and when you don't, you turn it off. The recording stops, right?
Yep.
You can't do that with a fax machine. You're getting anything that comes over the fax is coming to you. So in order to properly have a wall between the investigator and the search warrant, the affidavit for the Title III, we had to ask an AUSA, not one of the prosecutors on our case, but a separate AUSA who was read into the investigation to look at every one of the faxes. And that AUSA would say, okay, this one is relevant to your investigation, these are not. And so that was an interesting aspect of the investigation. What we found in the Title III, and we were running it simultaneously with the investigation up in New York. I mentioned earlier, there was a parallel major case called Cartnab, based off of Tommy Milo, who was a member of the Genovese family and associates of the Genovese, and the carting and landfilling operations that they had in New York. So we believe that there was some kind of association between these groups. It allowed Jake and I to go to another road trip. We went to New York City and spent a week listening to their Title III tapes, which was interesting as an aside. They were putting the physical surveillance devices inside suburban carting, and they were caught as burglars. So our technically trained agents were actually caught in that investigation.
Oh, wow.
Not a good day. That case was going on, and our case we still had not put our Title III in. So we get the affidavit, and this is an interesting part of this story. Chucky tells us Acmar is going to be difficult for you to install microphones, in the plant, in the offices. And we said, well, why is that? And he said, well, primarily because they have an armed guard 24/7 on the landfill.
And you're being told this after you are aware that tech agents in New York had already been caught. So you were extra sensitive to being detected.
Right, but we weren't discouraged. We just had to kind of think outside the box. So we had a meeting, and we asked Chucky about who's this guy that they have, on the midnight shift with the gun. Who's the guy sleeping overnight at the landfill? Because we needed to get the technically trained agents inside the landfill building to the various offices that we were going to put the devices on. And he said, well, he's just, some mope that's local. He doesn't seem to be that educated, and he's just, it's an easy job for him. I said, okay. What are the chances this guy would offer you protection if we set you up as a drug dealer and you were going to go do a drug deal, but you needed somebody with a gun to protect you? And he said, I don't know, that might work. So what we did is we had a field agent of ours who was a senior agent, undercover certified, and he ended up being the drug buyer. Actually, he was taking the drugs from Chucky. And we set up a surveillance where, preceding this, we had to do 7 days, 24 hours for 7 days of surveillance on the landfill. This was out of headquarters. The SERG out of headquarters said, you have to do 7 days, 24 hours, eyes on the property, every exit, every entrance that they have. So,
and is this basically for safety and security reasons of the agents involved, or?
Yeah, for the tech agents, because we reported that there was a guy who was armed on property, and they wanted to make sure, they want to know who was in, who was out, what times. So that was a difficult process, because there were two areas, for ingress and egress on this property. So we had to put two teams. We bought tents. We secreted the tents in the woods, and then we had two-man teams. So 4 agents, 24/7. Now, Jake and I pulled a shift pretty much every day for the 7 days. But that was a difficult sell to management, but it made a big difference because we had pretty good patterns of ingress and egress of the people. And we could go back to headquarters and say, okay, this is the pattern over a period of a week. Secondly, they said, you need to get the guy with the gun off the property or we're not going on. So then that's when we came up with this ruse. And we ended up having the SOG team on standby. We had Brent.
And that's the surveillance operation group.
Right. So these are agents that were trained to do surveillance. All of this required Chucky to go to this guy and say, listen, I'm going to sell some drugs. I need somebody with a gun because I'm going into a questionable area of town. Would you do it if I give you $1,500? The end of the day, it cost the FBI $1,500 for this guy to come off the property. Then we had them drive around and waste time while our tech team went into the landfill and installed all the microphones and did their magic. Both Jake and I were part of that team. We got to go on there as protection. Then they came back off of property. We told, go ahead and have the meeting. SOG on top of the meet, Chucky with the guy with the gun meets Brett. They give him the quote unquote drugs, which obviously were not real drugs. He gives them the $5,000. Chucky keeps the bulk of it, gives the guy $1,500. Everything's good. We were pretty confident that the guy with the gun is not going to tell his employer that he left the landfill to go earn $1,500 protecting the guy selling drugs.
Yeah, I think you could be pretty confident about that. But let me just ask you this. Why did they feel they needed somebody with a gun protecting the landfill? Just for illegal dumping, or was there something more to the need for an armed guard at the facility?
So that's a great question, because that was our question. Why would they need a guy with the gun guarding the landfill? And the best answer we could come up with is because they were associates of this larger group up in New York. They had evidence of criminal activity on the property that they were concerned about, and that they were interested in protecting that with a guy in the gun, to make sure nobody came on the property and stole that information. That was the best, because they weren't doing anything nefarious other than the illegal dumping of garbage. But once we did have the Title III up and running, what we discovered was they didn't really talk in the office unless they had a vacuum cleaner going, or if there was a call from New York, and there were several, you would hear the call coming in from New York, and Paul Burke would say, "I'll call you back in 15. He would hang up the phone and go to a payphone in Moody, Alabama to make the phone call. Now, part of that, we believe, was due to the fact that the team in New York had been caught trying to put the microphones in there. They were already hinky up in New York. And so it made sense that they were not comfortable talking in great detail, either in the office or on the phones in Acmar.
How did you get around that?
Well, what we ended up doing was, trying to tickle the wire by going and doing some interviews. And tickling the wire is just to try to stimulate conversations for your listeners. So what the FBI will do is they'll go possibly do an interview of a suspected bad guy to see if that suspected bad guy makes a phone call. And so we did that with some of the politicians, and we did get some calls. But again, it would be a very short call. Paul Burke saying, "I'll talk to you, I'll come to your office, or I'll, meet me at, Shoney's," and that kind of thing. The long and short, we ran the Title III for 60 days and realized that it was not going to be our best evidence. And we got a couple little pieces of information in terms of, like I mentioned, the association with the politicians. All of this led to, at the end of 1993, early 94, the indictments against James Solly, the mayor of Moody, Alabama, for program fraud violations. The strategy from our AUSA, Bill Barnett, was let's go ahead and bring one of these guys in. We'll go ahead and indict him on program fraud, and then we'll flip him. We'll offer him, proffer, and we'll flip him. So that's what we decided to do. And it didn't work out as good as we'd liked, because a number of reasons outside of our control. The long and short was he was acquitted on the program fraud charge. So that was sort of a blow, more for the prosecutor than the investigative team. And Bill Barnett said, "You know what, this case is too convoluted and I'm out." So we went to our SAC, Jake and I did, and we said, "Boss, the problem wasn't with the investigation," and I'll just leave it at that. "We need justice, main justice, if you don't mind. Can we call them, get them here, and look at this investigation and see if they're interested in picking this up as a RICO case?"
So you basically wanted a prosecutor who was trained or who specialized in these type of cases.
That's right. No insult meant for Mr. Burnett, but it was not in his lane. And so, and it's very unusual to have these types of cases in Alabama.
Talk about program fraud, because there may be some people who are scratching their head saying, "What program?"
Yeah, so program fraud is the federal equivalent of bribery for public corruption. It's Title 18, 666, and requires $5,000 exchanged or loss is the minimum. It also requires quid pro quo. So you hear about, this past several years about collusion. There's no such thing as collusion. We have conspiracy. And if you are giving something of value in exchange for something else of value in greater than $5,000, and you're a politician, then you have at the federal level what's known as program fraud. So in our case, we had James Solly, who was given $5,000 plus to go gamble in Atlantic City in exchange for contracts that weren't bid. Historically and required by their local laws, they were always bid. And he's the one that allowed the carting company to come in, double the price, and cut the service by half, what we argued, in exchange for these gifts, including $5,000 to go gamble in Atlantic City.
So why the acquittal?
Well, you know what? Again, without being critical of the way the case was presented, the jury foreman after the trial was in the same elevator as myself, Jake, and the prosecutor. And the jury foreman said, we all thought he was guilty, but you all just didn't prove your case. And I'll just, the case was scheduled for 2 weeks, and for reasons that I can't still explain, prosecutor ended it in a week. The long and short of that was it was a blow to the investigation. But again, for your listeners, it wasn't the end of the investigation. We asked, and our SAC had our back and said, I'll send this to the Department of Justice. If they say it's good, then they'll assign a prosecutor. As it turned out, they assigned 2 prosecutors. Then we met with the United States Attorney in Alabama, and he assigned another prosecutor, an AUSA, Ron Burleson. And so we ended up with a team of 3 prosecutors for the rest of the investigation.
That's definitely a signal that you're on the right track.
Right. And that's how we took it. And this would have been at the end of 95, early 1996. And at that point, we decided we needed to make a run at Paul Burke, even though we were still semi-covert in terms of our intent of this investigation. It became clear that we needed somebody to take us up to New York and help New York Division with the Milo case, the Cartnap case. The best way to do that, in our opinion, and our strategy, was to approach Paul Burke. But before we did that, Jerry, and this case had a lot of different facets to it, we were told, hey, you probably want to get with BSU, Behavioral Science Unit, and talk to them about Burke and the best way, the investigative strategy, best way to interrogate him. So this led to us contacting an agent named Pete Smerick. And Pete was a behavioral science unit profiler. In fact, he was pretty well known for the Waco. He wrote a memo about not doing an assault on the compound in Waco. Anyway, we met with Pete. Pete was a nice guy. He said, looking at all the evidence and looking at the bio that we dug up on Paul Burke, he said, what you need to do is a sort of a shock and awe interrogation. So the way those work, again, it's nothing classified here. The way those work is the profiler from Behavioral Science Unit will basically do an assessment, a behavioral assessment of the target, what their motives are, what their weaknesses are. As we were talking about, similar to informants, we were talking earlier, Chuck E. Cheese had placement and access. He was literally legally on the property, so he had placement and access. And in similar fashion, when you do an assessment, you look at what is it that the person you're targeting is vulnerable by? What is he susceptible to? Is it, money? Is it, fear of going back to jail? What is the best way to approach this guy? The long and short of that was we rented an office building several offices within this office building in Birmingham, Alabama. We spent a few dollars of Bureau money to set this up. We had pictures blown up of all of the surveillances that we had done from the Kentucky Derby and from other surveillances. We set up a whole room with what looked like, overtly looked like a lot of evidence. We had file cabinets that read, different years and taxes, Paul Burke, and then the tax in the year. We had agents sitting in the room with headphones that were listening to nothing. We had this whole kind of facade before we went, and we got the AUSA who prosecuted Paul Burke, because previously he had been convicted of cocaine smuggling. He was a pilot back in the mid-'80s, had gone to prison, We got the Kentucky AUSA to fly down, and then at 6:30 in the morning, when Paul Burke was leaving his house, that AUSA comes out of the Buick car, goes up to Paul and says, "Hey, Paul," they had developed somewhat of a decent relationship. And he said, "Paul, you're in a bit of trouble, and I'd like to help you." And that was intended to get Paul Burke to go to this office, to be willing to come to this office so that he could be shocked. And then a guy by the name of Robert Sly, another senior agent, played the role of inspector. We had organized crime task force, plaques made, and this whole thing. We had CCTV cameras put into this interrogation room. And all of that led to this interview with Paul Burke. The one mistake I made, Jerry, is I did not get a search warrant for his briefcase. So, set all that up. Jake and I are in a separate room, CCTV cameras going. We see Paul Burke he's put down, in a seat, waiting for the inspector. But we wanted him to take in all of the evidence that we had collected, the environmental stuff, everything. We wanted to really scare him as much as we could before we brought him into the interrogation. So he comes into the interrogation room and interviewed by Robert Sly, who's basically got a script, and basically Bob Sly tells him, you're going to go to jail. What we know, and based on the facts in this case, is you're going to go to jail for a short period of time if you cooperate, or you're going to go to jail for a long period of time if you don't. And there was less than 10-second pause from Paul Burke, and he turns to Robert Sly and he says, "Okay, you told me what's behind door number 1 and what's behind door number 2. Well, what's behind door number 3? I don't want to go to jail." And the AUSA that was working the case had not given us direction in terms of like a free pass. We had no authority to do that. All we were told is, you're going to jail, cooperate. We were pretty confident. And in retrospect, that was a mistake, because Paul Burke, there is no other option. There's no other door. You're going to jail, but we want your cooperation. Depends on your cooperation in terms of how long you go to jail. And they can go downward departure on the guidelines. It's Rule 35 if you cooperate with the government, right? So Paul Burke says, "I'm not going to jail, and if you don't have an arrest warrant, I'm leaving." And he leaves. So we were left with nothing else to do. Again, part of our strategy was, if he doesn't cooperate, what are we going to do? We're going to hit the landfill with a search warrant. We're going to hit the Kentucky offices with a search warrant. We had probable cause for both. And so that's when we went completely overt in our investigation. We had teams on standby and went in and took all the evidence that we, under the warrants. And then at that point, it was pretty much a fight between lawyers that lasted about another year, year and a half. It was prosecuted in 1998. The team out of Department of Justice, led by Ruth McCabe, a senior prosecutor, and Ron Burleson, who's out of Birmingham, they put together a very effective proffer. But instead of all of the charges that we thought we would have, including money laundering and some white collar stuff, they brought that down to a Clean Water Act violation, which was substantial enough to give Paul Burke, what did he get, a year, I think, in prison and 6 months in a halfway house. And then the landfill, which he was, quote unquote, the sole proprietor for, had to pay a $1.8 million fine, which at the time was the largest fine actually he got 8-month prison sentence, a 4-month halfway house, and a year's supervised release with a $1.8 million fine. In addition, $10,000 personal fine.
Well, you had mentioned the briefcase. To this day, do you think there was something in that briefcase that you missed out on an opportunity to gather additional evidence?
Well, you don't know what you don't know, right? It's the intelligence gap. And we ended up getting some good evidence in the search warrant. But always in the back of my mind, I'm thinking that there was something in that briefcase that would have helped us either with the case in New York or go back to the politicians back in Alabama. Tony Farino, who was the general manager of the landfill, also was convicted in the same case. The big part of the investigation, as it started unfolding, as it started maturing, was our intent, or the government's intent, to close the landfill down. What we found about that landfill was it shouldn't have been an unlined landfill to begin with. And so that subtitle D cell was fine. And now today it operates, but a different company called Superior operates it as a complete subtitle D cell. But at the end of the day, we were most concerned about the amount of pollution that was going into the drinking water. That creek that goes into the Cahaba River functions to serve 1/3 of the drinking water for the city of Birmingham. So when we're talking about Flint, Michigan, which, years and years later, we were, having the same kind of stuff happening right there in Birmingham, Alabama, where there was an intentional, willful disregard for public safety by polluting the aquifer and the drinking source. So anyway, the case ended up with him being sentenced. An interesting aside, which is also another road trip, we ended up having a proffer meeting with Burke's attorneys. They were the same attorneys that represented the Nissan Valdez case up in Nashville, Tennessee. The most beautiful offices I've ever seen. And we go in there, and the prosecutor they did an excellent job, laying the case out basically. And it never went to trial. This was an information. They both pled the information. But the defense attorney, as we're leaving, turned to me and said, "Remember, Andy, everything's about timing." And, I was at that time 5-6 years into my career. And, I was upset that we weren't, throwing the book at him, so to speak. Even though I was told, the 1.8 millions of, heavy, fine, and the, blah, 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 and that, I'm like, I wanted him to go to jail for 10 years, right? And then I realized as I matured, as agents, we shouldn't be concerned about the sentencing. Our job is really just to collect the evidence, and it's the justice system's job to determine the sentencing and the proper penalties for the criminal behavior. It's a maturation process for me as well.
Yeah, that's something to really think about, because we are investigators, and the U.S. Attorney's Office are the prosecutors, and then you have the whole judicial system, which determines the final judgment, the final sentencing, and we all have our parts to play.
Yeah, an interesting part to that in terms of that way of thinking, and I found this to be true with most agents, is that when we first start out, we are full of energy and all, and oftentimes we'll associate the criminal behavior with the person. We dislike the person, or in many cases, we might even, quote unquote, hate that person as a criminal for what they've done. As I matured as an investigator, I learned to separate the person from their behavior. So I didn't have a personal animus towards the criminal, just the behaviors that they were conducting. It allowed me to kind of check my own bias. And later, when I became an investigator, researcher, instructor at the Behavioral Science Unit, I tried to impart that to new agents, that our job is to be profoundly objective in the search of truth by the collection of evidence, and to kind of be in our ability as professionals to separate our personal opinions, although we're human, so we develop them, from the crime. And the way to do that is to separate the person from their behavior.
And I would think that also is very helpful when you're actually sitting down and speaking with someone, trying to gather information from them, if you can keep that in mind and have it more of an exchange of information, I guess you would say, as opposed to you grilling, or you used the word before, interrogating someone.
Absolutely. I mean, one of the things we taught or teach our new agents is how to develop empathy. And my wife, who is currently a special agent, works crimes against children, and she has to develop empathy with individuals who want to molest her children once they're arrested. And in order to do a proper interview or interrogation, you have to be able to separate that person, again, from that behavior, so that you can find something good about that person to develop that rapport, and oftentimes use that empathy to get them to admit things that they'd rather not admit.
This is really interesting, because the episode that I'm posting right after yours is with a retired agent by the name of Jim Kyle. I don't know if you know Jim, but yeah, and Jim is having he of course worked crimes against children for most of his career, but he also is currently working to talk about interview skills and using rapport and what's the word I want to use? and empathy, with subjects in order to gather as much information as possible. So it's kind of strange. I had no idea when we started this that it would flow into, this direction. So it's interesting that as an agent, you developed that understanding on your own and then continued to work with that as you advanced in your career.
On the same topic. So as I matriculated through the Bureau of my career, I went from the field to headquarters to eventually the training unit at the Academy in the Investigative Computer Training Unit. But then in an off chance, we're not going to talk about it today, but I was an undercover agent in the 90s. The guy that ran that program, Steve Band, Dr. Band saw me in the hallway, said, I need somebody like you over at the Behavioral Science Unit. That's where I ended up. And so we studied relationships, how to develop them and how to disrupt them. And what we found interestingly is that relationships are based on two things, trust and control. And when trust goes down, controls go up. So if you can build empathy and that trust, then you don't have to threaten them or use coercion. You don't have to use control measures to extract the truth. You can use the rapport that you've built and that empathy to seduce the truth from the individual. And we do that all the time as we develop informants or assets. And that's what I did. That's what I taught, and that's what I researched.
Well, we'll get into that a little bit more, but I do want to get back to this case because I know you had an acquittal for one of the elected officials. Did you have an opportunity in this case to go back and charge any of the other elected officials, for instance, who went to that Kentucky Derby?
Yeah, so that's a great question. So after that case with the public official, James Solly, as I mentioned, Maine Justice came in, and Maine Justice said, look, we know you guys have done a lot of work. We think there's a lot of process here. What's the prosecutorial goal of this case? And in that meeting, what came out of it was the landfill should be shut down. Paul Burke should be banned from running any type of landfill or contracts or so forth. And so all the focus shifted from the public corruption aspects, because what we could show was that these officials, these were small town country officials, we're taking anywhere from 5,000 to 7,000. As I mentioned, that statute, the minimum is 5,000. And so the prosecutors were like, those are small fish. And based on the interviews that you and Jake have conducted, none of these officials are willing to cooperate. As I mentioned, one public official there in Moody said, you guys can put me in jail, but they can do much worse. They can put me underground. So the decision was to really focus on the environmental stuff. And the shift of the investigation went from less public corruption, more environmental crimes. And so we didn't pursue any other.
But at least they were on notice.
Right. Again, what happened after this case was EPA disbarred Burke from any future federal contracts running a landfill. He couldn't get any kind of federal assistance for any of this work. So he filed an appeal in 1998, and a year later, after the case was adjudicated thereabouts, in 2001, it went to the appellate court. And the appellate court basically looked at the evidence and said, no, this is without merit, and he was denied his appeal. So at this point, I don't know where Burke is. I don't know if he's in the landfilling business or what he's doing. But the purpose of the investigation was successful, and as you don't look for these things in our line of work. But in 2000, Jake. Oh, and I should mention the IRS got involved in the investigation. They were quite instrumental in a lot of the investigation. EPA was involved in the investigation. FBI led the investigation. Jake and I and the investigative team were invited to Washington, D.C., and we were awarded the Attorney General's Environmental Crime Award, nice little certificate, which was kind of nice.
Very nice. Very nice. I forgot to ask you, whatever happened to Chuck E. Cheese?
Yes, interesting question, Jerry. So as the case was adjudicated, we didn't need Chucky as a witness. As I mentioned, he wasn't a confidential informant. He was a cooperating witness. So, but he insisted, because of the people that were being prosecuted, that we go ahead and meet with the Marshal Service. So we did the request, which is pretty stringent requirements, to meet with the service and offer witness protection. But we did it in a hotel. We met with the Marshal Service, and Chucky listened to what they had to say and the requirements of the program, and it scared the bejesus out of him. He left that meeting saying, I can't do that. I can't cut off all contacts, with my family. My wife's never going to accept that. And what am I going to do for a living? And on and on and on. So we went back to the drawing board, talked to the prosecutor and our SAC, and they came up with a substantial reward, if you will, 6 figures. And there was a big ceremony at the field office where he was presented this oversized check, and he was thanked for his service, which was instrumental in the investigation. As it turned out, that illegal cell was the big break in the case, and allowed the government not only to seize the landfill, but get a $1.8 million fine for the criminal activity.
Right. So it all worked out at the end for the government and for Chuck E. Cheese.
Absolutely. He could buy a lot of pizza with that check. So that's my Acmar case. I spent 27 years in the Bureau, but only 10 of them were as a field investigator. The rest of the time I was in management and at the Academy. But it was an interesting case for a young agent riding the coattails of a very senior and wise guy, Jake Jacobson. So I learned a lot in that investigation.
Well, why don't we talk a little bit about how you came into the FBI in the first place? When you joined the FBI and why you joined the FBI.
Yeah, okay. So when I was in college, I took a Myers-Briggs kind of assessment. Based on your personality traits, what would you be most suited to do? And it turned out it said the 2 jobs I was most suited was federal agent or judge. Were the 2. I didn't have the patience for law school, so I became an agent after the company I was working for filed bankruptcy. I spent about 9 years with Eastern Airlines, and I had been promoted up to the station manager with Eastern in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. In 1989, the wings of men were cut off really by Frank Lorenzo. 47,000 employees lost their job, and I had to lay off 37 employees myself and close the station down, only to reopen it a couple months later under bankruptcy. But at that point, I decided I got to look for another job. So I spoke with my father, who was a career military officer. He knew an FBI agent, and so I talked to the agent, who was an FCI guy, foreign counterintelligence guy. But he made the job sound cool and interesting. So I applied, even though I was in Milwaukee, I applied as my home of record in Atlanta. And the agent recruiter, a guy named Charlie Gent, he took a liking to me. And we processed, it took about 8 months, and I found myself at the Academy on February 5th, 1990, in new agents class. 90-4, we want more was our motto.
I don't think my class had a motto. I feel cheated.
It's funny because we had an old, I think he was a Marine. We would do those runs down to Lake Lunga, and he would do I think they're called Jonies, like a sing-song when you ran.
Right.
It was like 90-4, we want more. And I'd be in the back and say, no, we don't. And they'd go, yeah, we do. Yeah.
This is more than enough, right?
Exactly. I don't know what year you came in, but when I came in 90, we ran a lot.
I came in 1982. We didn't run a lot, but I was a runner. I actually did the Marine Corps Marathon while I was at the Academy.
Good for you. No, I would drive the 26 miles, but I don't know how to run it. I always argued in the fit test, if we have to run 1.5 miles to catch a bad guy, I'm in the wrong pursuit. I need to be in my butte car. I'll chase him down. But yeah, you have to be in shape, and the sprint was I was always good at short distances, but I get bored and my ADD kicks in after about 1 mile.
All right. So what are you doing now? You were mentioning to us that you went into the behavioral science unit, which of course is fascinating to me and anyone listening. We've talked to a number of people who career went in that direction, but the great thing about it, because I'm thinking as a retired agent, is how valuable you are post-retirement. So what are you doing now?
Well, that's an interesting question. So my history is maybe different than many, but in my case, I married an agent later in my life, earlier in hers. So I married an agent in 2010, 10 years ago, this October. And she wanted to move back home when we had a baby 5 years ago. So I moved back home knowing that I was going to be mandatory in a couple years. In 2017, after becoming mandatory for retirement, I started the Behavioral Science Unit, LLC. In 2014, the FBI did away with the Behavioral Science Unit, the Silence of the Lambs guys. It's now known as BAU5, part of CERG, the Critical Incident Response Group. So the Criminal Minds guys inherited the Behavioral Science Unit, became a unit within their section. At that point, in 2017, I was like, okay, I'm in the middle of New York, nowhere, central New York, surrounded by 375 head of cattle. What can I do in retirement? So I decided to hang a shingle as a behavioral science unit where I provide training on a number of topic issues that you can find at my website, www.behavioralscienceunit.com. Everything from conflict resolution and stress management to understanding the mindset of an extremist to interrogation and interview techniques to quote unquote, we don't profile. I never called myself a profiler. I'm a behavioral assessor, and understanding the process of analysis and applying that to understanding human behavior is something that I've researched and taught and do. So I provide consulting services. I'm a researcher for RAND Corporation. I occasionally do podcasts once a week with a psychologist out of Southern California.
And the name of the podcast?
It's the Dr. Carlos Show. And under that, he does Understanding the Criminal Mind with Andy Bringuel. And so those are the two that I do with him, usually about once a week. You can find the podcast on opslens.com, which is a free app that your listeners can download called Ops, O-P-S, Lens, Lens.com.
For your website and for the podcast, I'll make sure that I have links in this episode's show notes so people can access that if they don't have time right now to write everything down.
Thank you. Very generous of you. And then I'm published in 3 books. I'm writing a layman's guide to terrorism so that people understand what terrorism is and isn't. I try to stay busy. I'm also available for lectures and keynotes. I've done a number of those. Occasionally, you'll see me pop up in the media. I get a phone call from several people. Brian Ross from ABC News was someone who used to come to my classes and teach, and he calls me occasionally. So, yeah, that's what I do in my retirement. I just piddle and enjoy life.
Well, we're at the point of this episode for me to ask you for your last words. What would you like to say?
Well, I would say mostly this is directed to young people. I have kids from 28 down to 5 years old, so pretty long spread. But I encourage young people to look at our country and devote their adulthood to being not only just good citizens, but good public servants if the opportunity is available. My career in the FBI had many, many rewards. And my best day at Eastern Airlines didn't measure up to the worst day that I had as a bureau agent. I encourage young people to seek opportunities to serve our country. And whether it's in the military or whether it's in, a federal agency like the FBI, which I'm biased towards, or just being a good citizen even is a good public service. So if we don't do that, then we're really doomed. To those young people that are interested in the Bureau, I would encourage them to explore those opportunities. 2 of my adult children want to be agents. One is currently a border agent in Laredo, Texas, and the other currently works for the FBI in a surveillance capacity. And so my parting words are, I can't think of a better way to spend your career and your life than being an agent. It's not something you do, it's something you are. And I really enjoyed my 27 years serving the best boss in the world, the American people.
And that's the end of the interview. At jerrywilliams.com, you'll find a photo of Andy Bringuel and photos from the case of the landfill and the discharge of illegal pollutants. There are also links to a number of articles about the Acmar Landfill investigation and the Clean Water Act violation. I hope you enjoyed the episode and that you'll share it with your friends, family, and associates. If they're not sure how to listen to a podcast, have them read the post on my website, How to Listen to a Podcast. And don't forget to subscribe to FBI Retired Case File Review on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, or your favorite podcast app. I would also love it if you checked out the link for my books in your podcast app's description of this episode. My nonfiction books, FBI Myths and Misconceptions, a manual for armchair detectives, which goes through 20 cliches and misconceptions about the FBI in books, TV, and movies. And then there's the companion book, FBI Word Search Puzzles, Fun for Armchair Detectives. My FBI Philadelphia Corruption Squad crime series features flawed female FBI agent Carrie Wheeler in Pay to Play and Greedy Givers. All of my books are available wherever books are sold as ebooks, print books, and audiobooks. If you've already picked up copies of my books, please consider leaving a review. Reviews help readers find good books. Thank you for listening to the very end, and I hope you come back again for another episode of FBI Retired Case File Review with Jerry Williams. Thank you.